when we think about independence movement in India, oftentimes in the rest of the world, people don't know how much the women played a role, especially somebody like Kamaladevi. And Kamaladevi was not only a woman warrior with a huge cause, coming from a family rather with an unusual history. We'll hear more about that. But more than that, she was fearless to stand up to Gandhiji when he thought the women couldn't go on the Salt March, to actually disagree with him, but also completely get committed to the notion of grassroots movement that was so important for India's movement, the nonviolence movement and otherwise. So for me, the fact that the book is out, that is both about her own writing, a vociferous writer that she was, but also about her from other scholars. I am grateful, Ellen, to you and to Vinay Lal, to actually putting this book together, because we have an opportunity to not develop historical amnesia, which it seems to me we often think of, especially not just in India but elsewhere. So it is to make sure that these legacies live on, the ideas live on, and they can be also understood better with the test of time. So what we're going to do this evening is that we have three amazing speakers from very different perspectives, and we really want to explore the idea of Kamaladevi both as a freedom fighter, as a feminist, not just in the Indian context, but in a global context, because she was a global feminist, and her legacy and the relevance of her legacy in India today, and hopefully for the world today. So to do this, we will have three fabulous speakers, as you know. And some of you who have heard Gloria before, right on this stage with me some time ago, Gloria Steinem. She needs no introduction. She's the rock star of feminist movement everywhere. Yes, exactly. But the reality is that some of us who come out of Indian tradition, we just say, we claim her. Most people don't know that. It's because of her connection to India and specifically to Kamaladevi. We also are very privileged to have Ellen DuBois, who is the co-editor of this volume, A Passionate Life, Writings by and on Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. She's a professor of history, another feminist scholar, who we're delighted. She's here from UCLA. And then Ruchira Gupta, who is the feminist in her own right in multiple ways, but particularly as a founding director of Apne Aap, the fabulous organization that has done such important work on women trafficking anywhere in the world. She also is a professor at NYU. So please join me in welcoming our three panelists. What we're going to do is to speak from there. Each one of them will speak briefly from their perspective, and then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll open it up to all of you. So I know there are many of you in the audience who also have a lot of information. I know, Manu, you are here somewhere, so one of the writers for the book. So I hope that we will have a really interesting hour and a half together. So please join me in welcoming our three panelists. Thank you. So, Gloria, we thought we would start with you and your connection to Kamaladevi, but also to Indian women's movement in general.
I think our movements have always been connected in many different ways at each era, whether it was the movement of the 1900s or, it's, I think, very little understood how much we were connected. But to explain my personal connection, I should say that after I graduated from college, I went to live in India for 2 years. you may think this was, people did think this was odd, I have to say, in 1956.
But, because it was not the 1960s, right? When everybody was going to India, right?
But this is explained by the fact that my mother and both my grandmothers were theosophists. So I had been sitting in rooms in Toledo, Ohio, theosophical meetings with a coloring book at age 6, Lotus Leaves for the Young, or something. Right? So I think that stuck with me. I had taken a course in India when I was at Smith, which was rare, I have to say, in those days, to have a course on India. And then there was the very important element that I was engaged to be married when I was graduating, and I had to go very far away in order to avoid. Right. So this mix of circumstances meant that I went for a year and stayed for another year because I found myself in love with a whole different culture. And still my oldest friends are there, and many of my newer friends are there. But it actually wasn't until I'm sorry to say, it wasn't until I went back in the late 70s that I met Kamaladevi, and this happened because Devaki Srinivasan Jain, who had been my friend from before.
Who's in the book.
And she's in the book. It's an essay. Yeah.
We realized that, or we thought we discovered, you might say, that Gandhian tactics, obviously nonviolent tactics, would be very well suited to women's movements around the world, so we should write a pamphlet about them to distribute to women's movements. So we were very full of ourselves, wandering around, getting his letters, which was mainly the way he communicated with what we thought was a new idea. And then we went to see Kamaladevi, who sat on her porch, I remember rocking, giving us tea, listening to us patiently. And when we were finished, she said, "Well, my dear, we taught him everything he knew."
Shy she was not, right?
And it was my first realization that, of course, there had been a mammoth women's movement in India even before the full strength of the independence movement, working against child marriage and sati and many other desperately important causes for women. And their tactics were massive nonviolent marches and so on. And that was a big aha for me. That was the first time I realized that, wait a minute, some of the reasons we are attracted to great men are because they were our ideas in the first place. So I'm very grateful to now, thanks to Ellen's book, to get to know her much better than I did before. And I'm very grateful to this evening because I kind of feel like, when you have a great friend and you want somebody to meet them? Okay, this is the way I think we all feel about her. And she wrote about this country. She knew a great deal about this country. How many people here knew Kamaladevi before coming this evening? Or knew something about her?
In person? Wow.
No, not in person. Knew of.
Knew of.
Yeah,
knew of.
They're too young.
Right, exactly.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
That's great.
Okay, well, thanks to this book, I think you will know her much better. And I hope that each of us leaves here tonight as a personal connection to her, to introduce her, because she has so much to teach us right now, especially as India and the United States have what you might call a fascist chief of state. I'm just saying. Okay.
Ellen, this is obviously something that was a labor of love.
It was.
And amazingly, what was amazing to me is that you actually came to her relatively late as a feminist scholar. So tell us your impetus about why the book, how did you get into it, and what you learned vis-a-vis the feminist movement here.
Well, I'm not an Indian feminist historian. I'm not an Indian feminist. Mm-hmm. I'm an historian of American feminism. And I was branching out a little and wanted to do a book on international feminism between the world wars. And there are books about that subject, but they are entirely about Europe and a little bit about the United States. So I really wanted to move that story out a bit. I wanted to make Asia and Latin America important to this story, to try to get them to the center of the story. And very quickly, I realized that India was in many ways the key to the Asia part of the story. First of all, of course, the literature was more accessible to me because much of it was in English. But also, I was just astonished to discover how rich the Indian feminist tradition was. Most of the books that exist about Indian feminism concentrate on go up to the 20s and early 30s. I'm actually, my own work in the United States focuses on how women got the right to vote. So that's what I started looking at in India. And actually, the process by which Indian women got the right to vote had many stages. But the first stage was under British colonial oversight. And the British were beginning to dole out tiny little bits of self-government to the Indians. And the Indian women came, a delegation went to London, actually, to ask for women's rights. And the British said, we'll let the Indian men deal with that. That's a domestic problem. Confident, of course, that the Indian men, backward as they knew them to be, so much more backward than British men, would, of course, never vote to enfranchise Indian women. Well, that wasn't the case, because there was nothing like a challenge from the British overlords to get Indian men, even very conservative men, to say, oh, really? Oh, can nobody hear me? So in some ways, the core of the story, then things progressed, and the range of franchises for Indian women grew all the way through to 1947. This is a side comment about enfranchisement. But in places like India, you'll get lots of different dates for when Indian women were enfranchised. And sometimes the date will be 1947, as if nothing had happened prior to that. Anyhow, I was really interested in the interwar period, and very quickly it became clear to me that Kamaladevi, who was born in 1902, I think, was really a rising star in the nationalist movement. I asked Ruchira when we were getting ready whether Kamaladevi was the most important woman in the Congress movement in the 30s and 40s, and Ruchira said, well, her sister-in-law, Sarojini Naidu, was also important, but Kamaladevi had a much greater range than Sarojini Naidu. And she also left such a fabulous written record of so much range that I quickly fell in love with her. I have to say that she reminded me a little of my favorite figure in the history of American feminism, who is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for her fearlessness, her range, her radicalism. Just one little story. So I was ordering her books. I'm at the University of California, and a book came from maybe Berkeley or something, and it was one of her books, and there was her signature in green ink in the front, and I got so excited. And my colleague, who I had never done anything with, Vinay Lal, who is a great historian of Indian nationalism, was sitting in the lecture hall where I was going when I picked up this book. And I showed it to him because I was just so excited. I had to have someone to see it. And very quickly we decided we would do a book together. I think probably we had slightly different goals. I think Vinay's goal was to have the range of Kamaladevi appreciated in India, where her legacy has shrunk so that people think of her mainly in one of her last phases, which was she was, in some ways, the most important entrepreneur of Indian cottage industries and artisan work. but he wanted people to see that she was a great nationalist, she was a great feminist, and she was an internationalist. And my goal was to get this woman into what I thought of as the pantheon of international feminism. I wanted to clear a little space from the Pankhursts and Alice Paul and have some of these great figures from Asia and from Latin America. And so it was very fortuitous, but we decided to do this book. And then Vinay arranged for it to be published by Feminist Press in Delhi, Zuban Press. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous book. So, is that?
There you go.
Okay.
We'll come back to that. Ruchira, you have a whole different relationship to Kamala, and that is much more to do with now. And if you would talk a little bit about your own connection, and then we'll open it up among ourselves first.
Yeah, I knew about Kamaladevi right through my teenage years because my uncle...
Can you hear her okay? Okay.
Because my uncle was a close friend of hers. Both were socialists, Gandhian socialists, and they knew of each other. They had created the Congress Socialist Party together. And so I knew that there were fiery women leaders in the Indian national movement, and I began to explore who they were and how did they become these fiery women leaders. What did happen in the Indian national movement which created this unprecedented amount of women leaders in India. We got the vote automatically when we became independent. They were ambassadors, they were cabinet ministers, they were chief ministers of states. And this is in a country which the British write about 30 years previous, where there was child marriage, there was illiteracy among women, there was sati. What happened in these 30 years from 1917 to 1947 that changed everything? And so I began to study these leaders, and I found that actually many of them, and especially Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, influenced Gandhi and many of our political leaders to become the men they were who led our freedom struggle. So, for example, I was mesmerized by a story that when Gandhiji was planning the Salt March, to break the salt tax, he had plans that women would be standing on street corners and selling salt or singing songs, but they would not actually be marching to break the salt tax. But Kamaladevi went and accosted him, and she was 27 years old then. And she said, she told him, she said, women have to take part in this historic process. And the reason that they need to take part in this historic process is because they have stood shoulder to shoulder with the men in building the Congress party and fighting the freedom struggle. And Gandhiji conceded because he said, because she was right, and because he too had an open mind. He was always
because
open
he also
to
understood
change.
that this was not the right thing.
This was not the right thing. And he said, yes, go ahead, participate. But then she said, no, you have to issue a formal call to action. And he said, why? You don't know your sisters if you think they need a formal call to action. She said, because it is going to go down in history, that you call them to participate in the Salt March. So she was political as she was negotiating, and she had a sense of history which was unfolding in India at that moment. And then, of course, what did happen was that the whole world saw photographs of women, Sarojini Naidu next to Gandhiji, breaking the salt tax, marching to the sea, to the ocean, and all of that. And that changed women's participation in India forever. And so that was Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. After independence, she was brokenhearted by the partition of India. She opposed it. She writes again to Gandhiji saying that how can you allow India to be partitioned? And Gandhiji writes back to her saying that he cannot control it, the younger people want it. And he plans to go and live in Pakistan for the remaining years of his life. And she goes on to do something constructive, which is to create a refugee colony outside Delhi for people from Pakistan. And the colony at that time was based on artisan and handwork, which was so intrinsic to the grassroots approach that Gandhiji was talking about, that when any political action had to be done or any nation building, it must begin from the bottom and go to the top. So what Ellen was talking about, that Kamaladevi is known for her role in building institutions in India, like cottage industries, like the Craft Council, like the National School of Drama, was all part of her Gandhian understanding that change begins at the bottom and transforms at the top, and how that change is connected to what we do with our hands right down to the village level, or up from the village level, I should say. So these were the things which influenced me and attracted me to Kamaladevi, because I think now the way institutions are being dismantled in India, the way fascism is creeping in, women are being pushed back home. We are being told that we have to stay at home and have 4 children. We have to wear a certain kind of clothes, not go out at night. There's a whole new popular culture which is being created. No love affairs, between castes and marriages and
the dowry
religions
that have really.
So all of this for a young person, these are the issues we are dealing with right now in India. So for me, Kamaladevi again becomes relevant.
Right. You mentioned about her relationship with Gandhiji. And Ellen, that's something that it seemed to me in the book. It's very interesting that it is not a servile relationship by any stretch of the imagination, but that in fact there are many things that they seem to disagree on. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that. I was particularly struck by her notion of birth control. And Gandhiji, who always thought about the abstinence and where that came from, there's a whole lot of reasons why he said that. But there are a number of things like that they seem to not agree. And yet her devotion to Gandhiji is complete. So talk a little bit about that relationship.
Okay, Ruchira's told the Salt March story. And also, yes, the story which both shows her devotion to this method and her willingness to challenge Gandhi. I think that they were very similar. You've talked about, is this all right without the?
Yeah.
Okay. You've talked about the focus on the common people, but also, and I think this is not quite what people think of about Gandhi, they were both very pragmatic. I call her a utopian pragmatist. She had this very grand vision, but she really understood that the point was the process. She writes in one of the selections we have that democracy is a process. It is not a particular quality of the government. Maybe this is what you're alluding to. She was a feminist in many ways, even though, like so many other of the people in the 30s, like Virginia Woolf, who we think of as great feminists, she said, "Oh, I'm no feminist." But in one of the ways she was, is she had just a fabulous private life. She was
pretty revolutionary in the Indian context.
Yes, she was a child widow. Then, because she had a very progressive mother, she was allowed to remarry. She married into this very progressive, although somewhat authoritarian family, the Chattopadhyay.
Yes.
How's that?
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
And then he was a very romantic figure, but he was not a good husband. So she divorced him, and she only could divorce him because they'd married in a secular by secular authority. She couldn't have divorced him if they had had a Hindu marriage. So when it came time for her to get an official position on the Congress Party's working committee, I don't think it came out, or she learned that that Gandhi didn't want her on this committee because he was very puritanical in his ideas, and she suffered that. She suffered that kind of discrimination because she was known to be a woman of her own decisions. Now, the other thing you're talking about, which is related to this, is her are her politics about sexuality and birth control. I did want to read something, if I can,
Please.
briefly. What's interesting about this selection I'm going to read to you is it's written in 1939. And at this point, she's a pretty dogmatic Marxist. And so she writes stuff about the class struggle and all of this. But then she writes, and she's very critical, no, we're not like those bourgeois feminists. Then she says, one other demand, 1949, the women in India are seeking is to their inherent right to the right of motherhood. Social prejudice against birth control is almost savage in its ferocity. Severe penalties are imposed upon those who disseminate such knowledge. And she was, as Gloria has pointed out, she knew Margaret Sanger's work, and she knew Margaret Sanger when she came to this country. She went to New Mexico to meet her. Severe penalties are imposed upon those who disseminate this knowledge. The reason is twofold. The masculine-dominated society always stresses the importance of women as breeder. All imperialistic-minded rulers encourage large families. So that's her 1939 Marxism. But then she goes on and she says, the other reason is because women freed from the penalty of undesired motherhood will deal a death blow to man's vested interest in her. He can no more chain and enslave her through children. And therefore, this war, so it's 1939, this war, which, and she's mostly talking, usually when she talks about war, it's class war. This war, which woman is waging today against man, against society, against nature itself, is against her sexual dependence. For as long as woman cannot control her body and escape the sentence that nature seems to have just decreed upon her, her social and economic freedom would be innocuous. It is for the same reason that man strives desperately to thwart her efforts through religious canons, legal statutes, and social codes. So she was, even at this time where her politics were very class-oriented, she was very focused on birth control. She had one child, so we have every reason to expect she practiced.
But I think that what's interesting about that is that when Gandhiji talks about women, how different the tone is compared to this kind of a choice.
It's more idealized and reverential.
Right, absolutely. Yes. And that she's really talking about the sexual freedom as a fundamental right.
Yes.
And that is a very different and pretty radical kind of an idea, even for that time.
Well, as she says, it's wrong to think of Gandhi as a saint,
right,
or as a god. She just found him to be she just learned her politics from him, and by that I mean she learned her methods from him.
Gloria, in terms of often Kamaladevi's kind of position that the feminism that she practiced was not the same as what was going on in the West at the time, and that idea of the Indian version of feminism, I wonder if, because of your experience with Devaki also, did you find some differences as you were talking to them? Of course, at the time when you went, the women's movement here in that phase was just kind of getting started. So talk a little bit about that distinction between why A, they would make that distinction, and B, how that was practiced.
I think there was, and still is to some extent, a large bias against feminism because it's seen as being a U.S. export, if you know what I mean. It's seen as being centered here. Now, I always wondered why in Africa and Asia they weren't equally biased against Marx, who didn't come from Africa. So,
did you come up with an answer?
No. Yes, it's called Patriarchy 101. But I do think that that's part of it. But it took a while, but it's gone, I would say. We always got ideas from each other and support from each other, and certainly I would not be at all the same person if I hadn't lived in India for 2 years. And we would not have had, we would have been 10 or 20 years behind in this country, feminists in this country, about economic development. if it hadn't been for Ilabat and Sewa, which is the single biggest women's union, not only in India but in the world, who came here and taught us, as did many other women. So
the microfinancing and the
microfinancing, right? I mean, right. So it's always been present, but there has been an idea that we had to get over that the U.S. was exporting feminism. And I must say that some of the so-called revolutionary male movements in Africa and Asia and so on were into that because they didn't want to disturb their patriarchal power structure. So they were saying, no, you know,
it's an
that's
easier way
that's
out.
a Western idea.
Right.
Those days are gone. Okay, right? It's different now.
I mean, I think at the same time,
something
yes.
to that. I think her antagonism was not so much the United States; it was to Britain. And
kind of imperialism and the West.
So when she's coming onto the scene, the United States is not a fully fledged imperial power yet. It's rising. I want to use this as just an occasion to say, you've already mentioned this, she wrote 2 books about the United States when she was here. They're great books. As my colleague Vinay Lal says, one rarely gets, often, Westerners go to India and write their understandings, but rarely do you get the other part. And she had, also she's here in the United States during the Roosevelt years, so she actually really appreciates the kind of social reform politics of the Roosevelt administration.
And she has access to the highest level all the way to Eleanor Roosevelt.
She's entertained by the Roosevelts, which, as you pointed out, how did they know about her? That is really interesting. That she was really, they were her patrons. And the British were after her this whole period because they're involved in fighting the Quit India movement. And the United States, people in the Roosevelt administration are protecting her. So I think at that point, I'm in no way defending the United States against its imperialist excesses, but at this point, her real rage is against the British.
Well, and also I think we forget that the U.S. for quite a while was the first and only country that had successfully thrown off colonialism. Right. So, for instance, we've just been watching or many of us have been watching the documentary about Vietnam. Right. Ho Chi Minh lived in New York for a while when he was a cabin boy on a ship that docked here. And there were a whole cluster of various revolutionaries in what was then Harlem, which is now Sugar Hill, learning from each other and so on. So we forget that there was this whole era.
Gandhiji himself talked about Thoreau, no taxation, the whole tea revolt, very much an important part of his own way of thinking about the resistance. So we forget that it goes back and forth, actually, in a big way. But it seems to me that one of the things that, Ruchira, I wanted to ask you was that in terms of feminist movements in India, and it seemed that in the 70s, and perhaps even now, people actually look to folks like Kamaladevi, if they know at all, actually denigrate them. And part of it has to do with how they think of these groups of women as well as men, as they also actually, many of them, denigrate Gandhi as well. So talk a little bit about that shift and what's going on.
I think at one point there was a lot of questioning of Gandhiji because people thought he was casteist and because of the Pune Pact. And
describe the Pune Pact for those people who might not know.
Okay, so Gandhiji, at one point there was a debate about how Dalits would be accommodated in the Indian Constitution, and there was a pact made in Pune to decide that they would get this much and no more. And many Dalit leaders at that time felt that they had been let down because of that. And they felt Gandhiji, because he was the big leader of India, went along with it, and he was the one who actually tactically thought through what the Pune Pact should be. So they blamed him for it. And Gandhiji actually had some role in it, but he was not the only one, because he believed in consensus and he believed in carrying people along. And he would go as far as he could to keep the movement going till he could achieve
Which is the big issue for him, it's just that how to keep everybody together for that ultimate
quit
movement,
India, right? And so that was one reason why people blamed him. And so the answer to that has always been that if he was casteist, then why would he clean toilets? And why would he make leather shoes? He did all the tasks which were supposed to be polluting tasks and which were supposed to belong to the most oppressed or Dalit caste. So he was not casteist, but he was definitely tactical while trying to negotiate for the independence of India. The other thing many people blamed him for was the partition of India. And they would talk about the fact that why did he go along with it? He did go along with it, but he was not for it. And there is this dialogue between Kamaladevi and him, but his own writings, where he writes about how he was very unhappy. And actually on the night that India got independence, he was sleeping. And he told the two women who were with him that he was not happy. It was one of the saddest days of his life. And that he wanted to spend his last years in Pakistan. And he felt Pakistan had been unfairly done by. So again, he gave in to the leaders who had emerged through the independence struggle, because that was also his moral compass, that, you know, now that there are leaders and it has to be democratic, that they have to take decisions and it cannot be decided by him unilaterally. So there was a lot of blame against Gandhi. Gandhian style of development was also considered it might push India backwards, and one of those things was Gandhi and Nehru have this dialogue all the time about the kind of development that India should engage in. So, Gandhiji wanted the Gram Swaraj, or economy which is rooted in village life in India, where people make things by hand and exchange things, and rooted in agriculture. Whereas Nehru felt that we had to build industries.
So Gandhi was Jefferson and Nehru was Hamilton.
Something like that, yes. Something like that. And so again, there Kamaladevi comes in, because she had informed Gandhiji to a large extent about how women in India lived, what they made, how their lives were woven around agriculture and making handcraft. And so, and that is what Kamaladevi continued to do after independence. But nobody looked at that, because nobody went into the details of things. They were just rejected.
Also, the political context of the handicraft movement is not completely understood. So people think that it was just kind of a cop-out, right? That she now is doing this little nice, soft things without understanding that it was back onto the basis of village development and why that was important. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I noted in my introduction is that in the period in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s, politics and social reform were counterposed.
Right.
Politics was what men did, social reform was what women did. And she was always enraged at the idea that social reform, or even what she called social work, was so denigrated. And one of the points I make is that the post-1970s feminist movement, women's liberation,
Right, that's in the book, yeah.
helps to repair that. Just as we talk about how women's liberation made the personal political, it also made the social political. And that's part of what I think has brought Kamaladevi back, her insistence that the nature of the society was itself foundational and had to be changed. And just political change was, in the narrow sense, was insufficient. I guess the other point I want to make in connection with Ruchira's story is that we all know that going from being a revolutionary leader to a leader of a nation is a very difficult move, and very few people have done it. And Gandhi didn't do it. He chose not to. And she said, at the time of partition, she said, when she lost that battle, she said, "I'm done with politics. It's not what I was set out to be." So she made a choice. She could clearly have been a minister in the government.
But I want to just add to that, qualify what Ellen is saying, that on one hand she said she was done with politics, but her entire life was completely political. Right. She just chose a different kind of politics.
Right. That's why I think even the handicraft thing is a political statement too. She may not be in politics, but it's,
Well, and it's important. I mean, right after independence, it seemed like these quote-unquote masculine priorities were, you know, steel plants and airlines and so on were primary. And she was pointing out the importance, I mean, the you know, millions and millions of people who are employed doing handicrafts and so on. But incidentally, that turned out to be a way more major export and more valuable economically. And I mean, think about it. How many people here have something on made in India, right? Okay, and have, you know, for a half century. So it was economics, and she just was trying to degender economics.
Yeah, one of the things I learned from this book, and from her protege, Devaki Jain, is that I never quite understood what feminist development politics were. And Devaki wrote a really good book about this, and Kamaladevi, I can't say that she started or led it, but she helped me to understand it, that exactly what Gloria was saying, which is that classic development politics, which were big industry, feminists of the 70s began to realize that this not only left women behind, but it pushed them down. And it is very clear that Kamaladevi thought that working at the cottage level was something crucial for women and for women's economic independence. It was how they were going to have an economic role of their own. So she's the development of this feminist development politics, which occurs mostly through the intervention of the global South in United Nations politics, gives her, in some ways, a new lease on life in the late 70s.
Right. I mean, one of the things in the book that also comes up is her internationalism and her connection to other global South leaders, as well as in the Human Rights Commission, which is in the book as well. And it seems to me that that, too, is not always understood, that as early as in the late 30s and early 40s, that she is going around. Now, the question I have is that I have not quite understood why and how, when in 42 Quit India is going on, 41 is a very powerful time for the movement. Why is she traveling outside? And what's really going on?
I think the story I've been told is, well, two things. One is she was defeated. The story I told about her not being allowed to be in the Congress working group,
committee.
She felt there was no room for her. Then this lone child that she had was going abroad. He was going to England for an engineering degree. Ram, right?
I think he came to MIT.
What, Manu?
MIT, United States, yeah.
So she left. So first she goes to Copenhagen, where she goes back to a meeting of the International Alliance of Women, which is the European-led international feminist group. And whereas she had been there earlier as a kind of young acolyte, this time, it's 1939, she's fed up with the British talking about how everybody has to come together to fight German fascism, and they're not saying a word about India. And she combines forces with the great Egyptian feminist Huda Sharawi, and they sort of call out the British leaders of the International Feminist Organization, which is pretty tough for them. And then, by that point, she's stuck outside of India, and then she goes to the United States, and then she can't cross, and the British won't let her back in. So she spends about a year in the United States under the tutelage of the Roosevelts, not the tutelage, but the protection. This is the two books, I can't remember, I'll look up the titles. the people she meets, she has a story about meeting Robert Oppenheimer, which is unbelievable. It's just fabulous. And he tries to impress her with his, his knowledge of
Hinduism and
and
Vedas.
And then, like a little bit later, there's an atomic bomb, and, she says, what's going on? And then she leaves there, and she's determined. So it's now 1940. She goes to China and to Japan during the war.
Right, exactly.
So she's in Japan during the war, and the Japanese are sort of trying to romance India so that they're a little bit nice to her. And then she's determined to get into China. She's having, and so she goes, and she is under the protection of the Sun Yat-sens and the Chiang Kai-sheks, and Madame Sun Yat-sen and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And she's having trouble. Manu, you didn't write the article about passports, right? Somebody else wrote the article about passports. The British are hounding her. They won't let her, they trap her in Hong Kong.
Right.
And she's trying to get out, she's trying to get to India, she's trying to get to China. And so she wrote one book on Japan and one book on China. And then we were able to get a set of letters that she wrote to her friend Mary Van Cleek, the American social reformer. These letters have never been published, and they are unbelievable. They're great letters. She's writing from China, she's writing Japan during the war. So I think the book was worth it just for these letters.
But you can tell there's a lot of excitement, so we all have to pay attention.
I'm not even sure what question you asked.
Oh, never mind. You told everybody why the book is worth it is because of the letters, so why not? Why don't we open it up to all of you? And I think there are microphones on both sides. And please identify yourself, and if you have a comment or a question, and if it's for a specific person.
Because we cannot see a thing,
right.
I promise you.
So we have to do this. So see if there's a hand. Yes,
and
there's
really,
a hand right here.
And if people knew her or knew of her, we want it. We want it.
So right here, please. Do we have a microphone?
Yes, we do.
Yes, thank you. Right here, in the front. Yes. And then we'll try to identify the next person as well, right over there. Fine, good, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Desai. I was wondering how I would start. I will be very brief. I knew both of them, Dr. Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay and Devaki Jain. And not because I was looking for an icon or something, I was doing a paper for UNESCO on the status of women in India. And the title of that paper was Myth and Reality. That's the background. And
speak a little bit more to the mic so we can hear you
properly. And my
properly.
boss, who was the chief of intelligence in India, my specialization is in weapons. And I also happen to be the first woman in the history of United Nations to make the chief of the weapons branch. So that apart, it goes back to those two ladies. So while writing that paper, my chief asked me to go and see Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay. This is in the late 70s, very late 70s. She wasn't giving any interviews. She wasn't known as a feminist or anything. She was more interested in the quotidian. So I met her. It was not because of feminism that she was known. She was known for all the
handicrafts and yes,
for
by
all
70s.
The reasons that both of you have said, and my compliments to you. I went to see her. The moment she saw me, she said, "I have very little to talk to you girls."
I have very little to talk to you about.
I have very little to talk to you girls.
What year was this?
1970s.
I said late 70s.
Late 70s.
Very late 70s.
After the emergency.
Right.
She was, I'm sorry.
After emergency, yes.
No.
During the emergency.
No, 79.
It was
75 to 77.
Must be around 78,
okay.
that
Right.
period. Beautiful woman, stunningly beautiful woman, very aristocratic. So let me repeat, She said, I don't want to talk to you girls, because my boss had told me what I wanted to ask her. And I felt very stupid, and I said, but I haven't asked you what I want to ask. She was a bit amused. She asked me to sit down. I told her about my paper. So why are you girls looking for equality?
Equality.
Why are you girls looking for equality? Mm-hmm. And then before I could say, she said, are men our equals that you want to be their equal?
That's our men are the equals you want to be. I mean, she's saying, who wants to be equal?
And after that, right? I said, Mrs. Chattopadhyay, I have nothing more to ask you. She said, no, you sit here now and have lunch with me. So I spent 3 hours with her, which will remain in my memory. Dr. Devaki Jain, brilliant, chain smoking, nothing to do with Gandhiji. She was not at all respectful of Mr. Gandhi. And I came from a generation of women in India who wondered, why should he be called a Mahatma? Because he asked 2 young girls to come and sleep with him and did nothing to them. It said it was a punishment for them, not a reward for him. But that's the generation I belong to. Let me go back to Devaki Jain. Chain smoking, stunningly beautiful, excellent economist. Just was dumped in my room, in my office, because my boss had something else to do. And she said, hey, did you see Kamala? I said, yes. And I said, I'm doomed. I don't know what happened. She said, I have a question for you, writing this paper for UNESCO. What do you want to become? So I said very politely, I said, Dr. Jain, I don't want to become anything. I want to be somebody. So we stayed together for another couple of hours. And I'm very encouraged, Dr. Desai, and you said that, what about the world looking towards India? I do not know any other culture or religion in the world that has got as many goddesses as we have. We have contempt for them, we have deification for them. And let me stop here, because what I want to say to this thing is, why are they looking to India? I think Devaki and Kamaladevi were ahead of their time in the 70s, and they are ahead of their time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Why are you looking to India?
So, hand back there. And then we'll see if there is another hand on this side. And if there's a question for one of the panelists, please tell us who. Yeah.
My name is Geeta Mittal. I'm from Kanpur, India, and I currently live in Boston. And I had the greatest pleasure of meeting Kamaladevi ji when I was a teenager. She used to come to Kanpur because my mother, my late mother, was about 20 years younger than her. And she was completely in love with Kamaladevi. I mean, she had a husband, my father was there. But she would do anything for her, partly because of my mother, when she got married at the age of 17 from Lahore, she came to Kanpur. At the age of 22, she's already part of the All India Women's Conference, and she was pretty much of an active person in that sense, and she roped in everybody who was shy or just got people in to join. And I think she had met Kamaladevi ji, I don't know exactly when, because Kamaladevi ji was a big force in the All India Women's Conference and the president. And so she knew a lot of women, and she used to always invite them to our home in Kanpur, which was open. And there were many conferences. So Kamaladevi visited us partly because of that association. And the other was my mother used to offer her my father's car and driver and say that we can just go to all the places that you know in UP which have crafts, Varanasi, Firozpur, Firokhabad, all kinds of places. And we'll go and you teach me about crafts and I'll take you wherever you want to go. So she traveled a lot with her. Not only that, in other parts of the country. And Kamaladevi would come to our house, and at that time I was a teenager and had 2 brothers, and we were very naughty. We used to say, oh, what a gorgeous lady she is. But let's give her a shorter name, and we used to call her KDCP. So in our family, we used to always call her KDCP. anyway, we had this very close association. But then when I came as a student to America in 1970, and then I was a married person and lived in Irvine, my mother visited me in 1976. And at that time, Kamaladevi came to the States. So my mother was always following her and tracking her. So she said, well, she's in the East Coast, and I was in California, in Irvine. So she and I flew. We made this plan to fly to Boston, rent a car, pick up Kamaladevi ji from one of her very illustrious friends, and I drove her through the Berkshires, through Connecticut, and we always stayed in people's homes. And guess where we ended in New York? I don't think you remember Gloria Steinem, but we ended in your apartment.
Oh my God.
You're kidding me.
Really? So that's
your hospitality.
that was in 1976. So anyway, I have many, many stories about Kamaladevi ji. You've done the academic work.
Possible?
You've done.
You were telling me that she was in my apartment.
There you go.
1976.
To her place in New York.
I was in your apartment, so she.
In my apartment.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm putting a plaque on my apartment.
There you go. Manu,
Yeah.
we have one of the contributors to the book, and I wonder if you might just say a word on what you have learned and sort of your assessment of Kamaladevi.
Whose hand?
Can we give Professor Bhagwan
Right
in the middle? Just try to move a little bit from the narrative.
One of the pleasures of this book was to collect several scholars in India and the United States who had already noticed her, and it was not hard to get people to participate. People, and Manu was one of them.
So, Professor Bhagwan.
Oh, well, thank you. I wasn't expecting to. I didn't have my hand up.
That's why I called on you.
Well, thank you for a very enlightening discussion, and Ellen for putting together the book. I don't have a lot to add because you've filled in, you've sort of filled in the picture so well. My interest in her has to do with her work on the Human Rights Commission and her work in international affairs, and in particular some of the ideas she pushed through in terms of implementation of human rights at an international level. I guess I'll throw this out as a question for the panel, for all of the panelists to talk about. Kamaladevi fits into a bigger picture of Indian women participating at all levels, and Ruchira, you
In the UN, right?
No, sort of broadly.
Generally in the
Yeah,
society.
you have Aruna Asif Ali, you have Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, you have Hansa Mehta, Rajkumari Amritkar. You have a long list of these kinds of folks. Could you maybe fill in a little bit for us? How do you have such participation at such an early stage? Are they all in conversation with one another? Where does Kamaladevi fit into that?
Yeah.
Okay.
What?
Can I just add a question?
Yes, it's the same question.
It's similar. I mean, I'm interested in the national versus transnational sort of element here because it seems to me it's very easy to recuperate someone like her into just the Indian nationalist movement. And I mean, I think, as you've indicated, she's much bigger than that. And so, I mean, I'm very ignorant about any of, anything in her generation with women like her transferring or having counterpart movements or connections, for example, across the border, which would make a lot of sense, right, with burgeoning Pakistani feminist and Pakistani feminist movement. So I'm curious if you found anything of that ilk with her. And largely, since you've already mentioned the Global South and you've mentioned, Huda Sharawi, were there, and does your book mention these, but were there kind of particular agenda or action items that were presented for forging those kinds of connections around particular issues having to do with women's economic, political rights, which would be quite different, I imagine, than certainly a kind of liberal Western feminist agenda, right? So I'd be very interested to know what you
what you found about that. Thank you.
So there's a kind of a two-part questions. One, what Manu is throwing out, which is this notion of
Legacy.
Number of other women who are there, and then to amplify those who are in the transnational side of things in addition to the nationalists.
So let me answer the first part first. First of all, I don't use the term transnational. I use the term international because that's the term they used. And one of the things that drew me to her and to other Indian women like Hansa Mehta was that when I looked at the early years of women's rights at the United Nations, I'm talking 1947, U.S. women are not only not there, they're opposed to any kind of international feminism. Ditto UK women. All of the major figures are either Asian or Latin American. A lot of Latin American women. So in some ways, it was the driving force of my larger book on international feminism. So the idea that we sometimes get that an international feminism that is not just Eurocentric starts with Mexico City in 1975, not true. The United Nations, from the beginning, the Commission on the Status of Women, would not have been there without
International
Indian
women.
And also, who was the Indian man who was head of the Human Rights Commission that allowed the Women's Rights Commission, the Commission on the Status of Women? I have to look up the name.
I know that there was an Indian women ambassador called Vijay Lakshmi Pandit.
But Hansaben was very involved with the Human Rights Commission, right? Yeah.
Right. So when they make a presentation to have a separate Commission on the Status of Women, which couldn't have been more important, if women, as Eleanor Roosevelt wanted, would have been subsumed under the Human Rights Commission, we know what the Human Rights Commission became. It was a terrible political football, and so there was an independent Commission on the Status of Women that nobody but a handful of international feminists cared about through the 50s and early 60s, and they were able to proceed and do their work. So that would be the first part of the question, and so I'll make Ruchira answer the hard part.
I'll try my best, Manu, because this is a long answer. But basically, the legacy of Kamaladevi precedes her because there was a very robust women's movement, which Gloria alluded to. And those women were the ones who asked Kamaladevi, as a young 19-year-old, to fight elections. And this movement was started by women in different parts of India. And much of it was in Calcutta, where there was a whole group of women, including one of the Tagores, who were fighting against or for widow remarriage, against illiteracy, against child marriage, against sati. And there were such women in each city all across India because there was a reform movement going on. And when young men and women were thinking they have to challenge colonialism, they were also thinking that they have to challenge something which was pulling Indians and India down. And so they were looking at what was going on. Many of the young men went abroad to study. They took their wives with them. They came back with ideas which were happening. So there was a lot of interconnection and interdependence of ideas at that time. And so when Kamaladevi is asked by Margaret Cousins to stand for election, she says that suddenly she discovered that she was a leader, she could speak, and that's how she began to participate more and more politically. And there were other women who were already doing so before her. The All India Women's Conference existed before Kamaladevi. And then it continues, and they keep mentoring other leaders. When Kamaladevi goes to jail, for example, after the salt tax, after she breaks the salt tax, and there she sees other women, she starts organizing them, she starts putting flowers in her hair. There are prostitutes who are in jail opposite her. She starts talking to them, understanding how women who were destitute lived, and also understanding different things, as she also learns from Gandhi, that how is he able to build a mass movement. And one of the things which she appreciates about Gandhi, which she then imbibes into her life completely, is the fact that he is the first leader who thinks of a way that the poorest of women can participate in the freedom struggle. So he chooses tactics like spinning, which any woman in any village can do in her home without having the mobility to go out. He chooses things like picketing, which again a woman can do. He chooses a whole campaign against alcoholism so people can go and protest liquor, or burning of cloth made abroad. So he chooses things in which women can participate, and that's when Kamaladevi writes in her own writings that she begins to understand that democracy can be very participatory and movements can be very participatory. And then of course she has her own influences. She's the first one who travels so much that she understands fascism, which Indians at that time did not understand wholly or fully. They were so preoccupied with colonialism. And she begins to think about how the women's movement can challenge fascism. Much of her writings comes from looking at that, besides class struggles, besides looking at bottom-up approaches, which she continues all her life. And even in terms of sex and sexuality, she challenges through her own personal life. Just as Gandhi says, my life is my message, so is Kamaladevi's. She has numerous affairs. The International movement was a flesh and blood movement. So nobody was a saint. And she always says Gandhi was no saint either, which Gandhi himself also says. And even the time when he sleeps with the two women, he actually believes that sexual desire causes a desire to rule and dominate. And the partition of India was somehow connected to this desire to have property, dominate, and have an ego, which is what he's experimenting with. And one of the women who slept with him actually writes a book later in which she says that he subsumed his sexuality to such an extent that she almost felt he was like his mother. He was like her mother. So she writes, Bapu, my mother. The book is called that.
And she was his niece, right?
She was
one of
the nieces, yeah.
One of them.
But I think that one of the things that, Manu, you were asking about the whole range of women, but I also think that it's partly related also to the nationalist struggle too, that the social and the political coming together really had a very powerful impact. And the thing I know best is actually this All India Women's Congress camps, where she would literally go individually to different cities and identify promising young women, bring them together. And I know my mother, when she was one of these women who was selected, she writes a letter at the time and says that it's amazing for me to meet people from Calcutta and from Chennai and from Mangalore. And at a time in India where we all know that India was not yet completely a nation, there wasn't really a chance for people to meet from everywhere else. So there was some energy put together around bringing this notion of a national movement for women as well as for the others. And she was very instrumental in doing that.
No, I mean, the two experts here can tell me, but I think that
But she stayed at your house, Gloria.
How did you always said you met her in Delhi?
I've gone mad. Okay. I think she understood, or at least challenged, if she didn't name it, but I think she named it, that the idea, politics is what happens to men, culture is what happens to women, but it's all power. It's all about power, right? So the first step in every hierarchy is controlling reproduction, which means controlling the bodies of women. So, she wasn't, in her actions, dividing things into political and cultural, because that is, the world is divided into two kinds of people, those who divide everything into two and those who don't, okay? And she did not, right?
The political was cultural and cultural was political.
She was just seeing life as it really is. And some of the things, I don't want us to get, too far into the past without seeing what we can learn from her now, And some of the things are just, it is what we can learn from her now. But some of the things were just so simple. And one of the things I put in my introduction, which totally struck me, was that Devaki had been part of a large group that was giving her a prize toward the end of her life. And she, Kamaladevi, would not accept the prize on stage. She only would accept it in the back of the auditorium, so that the people who were first here would be last, and the people who were last would be first. Okay. So just the most simple actions to overcome hierarchies, to overcome this kind of division, to see that we can be a circle, not a pyramid, to take handicrafts and make them the big export. I don't know. It was all about, it seems to me, in various ways, overcoming these hierarchies.
And I think that's where she was so Gandhian, because she understood the means are the end.
Right.
And that is so essentially Kamaladevi. Like, she challenges him, she differs with him, but she also understands him more deeply than so many other people who never challenged him.
She knew the specialness of that method.
Yeah.
That was important,
I'd like to try and answer this question if I understood it at all. I was looking for a selection. All right, so I think it's important to put her in time. She dies in 89. She writes her biography in 83. She's really at the end of her life. So there's a piece here that we discovered. So 1975 is Mexico City, right? 1975 is Mexico City. And the first UN International Conference on Women, and each country was supposed to have, to survey its own activities and do something about it. In fact, as we now know, the Houston Conference, even though it came after Mexico City, was the United States version of doing a national conference for this international project. So Devaki, who, I don't know how old she was, maybe she was in her 30s, put together a book called From Indian Women, and she asked Kamaladevi to write the introduction. So at this point, Kamaladevi is in her 70s. And let's remember, so, the women's liberation is just pretty infant at this point, certainly as an international movement. But the thing she says, so she's not able to talk about a vital, thriving mass movement of women in India. But the thing she says is that the post-independence generation has gotten too used to thinking about the state as accomplishing everything.
That's right. Yeah.
And that people now think of independence as being so you can now have a career, and that your ability to be free is entirely about your individual development. And this piece is mostly about the necessity of popular mobilization. That's what she has to say, and it hasn't happened yet, but that's what she wants.
Yeah, it's important.
There's a hand there, and then we'll pick up another hand back over there.
Maybe.
So there's a one, right there. And then we'll go back to you, the gentleman back in there. So can you come forward? Where's the mic? Yeah. Do we have a mic?
Okay, where should I give this?
Back over there. I'm sorry.
Behind you, the lady in white.
The one in white, and then there is a male behind that, and then we'll come back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask my question?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Please.
Thank you for this terrific discussion. I wanted to ask a question to all the panelists, but probably starting with Ruchira. Looking at contemporary India, where the space for feminism is shrinking, what can feminists, and I mean both men and women, learn from the tactics of Kamaladevi? And I guess at a broader level, I mean, sitting here, that space for feminism is shrinking everywhere, where we have these sort of the rise of fascist leaders. So what are the lessons, and how do we sort of get inspired and get mobilized by sort of imbibing some of, those tactics?
I think I would say three things, because I would like to hear what the other panelists say too. The first is build alliances, nationally and internationally, which Kamaladevi was really good at, and I think that is huge right now, because we have to be able to converse with each other, share what is going on in our countries, both the good and the bad, and so therefore we can stand up to it together because the world is so interconnected, even more so than Kamaladevi's time. So to build international alliances, build linkages between different movements across the world is very important. Also for the feminist movement to build cross alliances with other movements. So for the feminist movement to build an alliance with Black Lives Matter, with environmental movements, with class struggles, with farm workers' rights, because anyway we all are part of it. Half of them are all women, right? So we have to build all these alliances across borders and across sectors. That is really, really important. The other thing which Gloria spoke about is to build alliance across class, which is to look at, one of the reasons why Kamaladevi had this insistence on craft and things which were handmade was because she said that is how you can connect with the village woman, the last person, because they do live off what they can make, and not to lose that skill or that tradition. So I think we have to think about the last person we know, the most vulnerable human being, and see how we can reach that person as we build our alliances and carry on our movements, because we will have more legitimacy if we do so. And, the war of fascism is basically on the last, the poorest of the poor, on women, on Dalit women more so, on working class Dalit women more so, and on poor children. So that's how, those are the patterns you can see in India and the United States, as welfare is now a dirty word, but as welfare is being cut, healthcare, low-cost food, low-cost housing. So things like that, we have to think about those things and learn from Kamaladevi, the bottom-up approach and building of alliances. And the means we adopt, non-violence. And, we are just recovering from Las Vegas, and we know what happens when guns are so rampant and all of that. What are the means we adopt to rebel? And the third thing, which I mentioned that I would learn from Kamaladevi, is the personal is political, and to enjoy the struggle for independence, without being saintly, and as enjoying it and having fun while doing so.
So I would say two things. One is you got to take the long haul. You got to take the long approach. But the other thing is one of the great of the many lies about feminism is that it's a single issue movement. It's a lie. It's always been a lie. And that's what Kamaladevi shows us. I once described this as living at the point of the hyphen, living at the tension between feminism and take your pick. But she lived there, and so that's my point. I won't repeat it.
And I just would one more word. It's politics of listening, which is something we were talking about before. So it's not just the grassroots, but truly understanding people where they're coming from, especially those who are at a different level of the society, that she really, really believed in so fundamentally, that I think is so relevant right now. We have time only for last question.
But and Gloria hasn't answered.
Gloria, yes, and we'll have Gloria answer the next question. Whatever it is, right? Go ahead.
Well, Ellen mentioned the importance of Marxism to her in the 1930s in terms of understanding the natalism of imperialism and so forth. And you mentioned just now, Ellen, the living at the hyphen. Did she break with what happened later? Because I'm thinking about how extraordinary Indian Marxism in the 60s and 70s was, and whether she had any connection with it or not. I'm not thinking so much about the communist parties as the intellectuals.
Well, I don't know about the intellectual work. She was very anti-communist. She felt that the communists, and I don't mean in a kind of right-wing anti-communist, she felt that communists were always taking the short way out, that they believed in shortcuts, and she did not believe in shortcuts. She understood that social reform was a slow and laborious process. I don't know enough about the history of the Indian left to really answer this, but I do know that she was definitely a democratic socialist, and you probably know this.
Well, she's very close to Ram Manohar Lohia, who is an ultimate,
There were
major
certain things
socialist
that Indian
leader.
communists did in certain points that she hated.
Well, I don't know the connection exactly, but M.N. Roy, who was the head of the Indian Communist Party, left the Communist Party because he could see that it was controlled by Russia, and he really named the big problem of Marxism, which was that it kind of told you that the ends justify the means, when in fact the means become the ends. Right. And we should remember that Marx and Engels got their inspiration from upstate New York headquarters of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, who were the group of 7 big nations in North America. And that was their idea of primitive communism, but they left out the big thing, which is they understood that the means are the ends. And so M.N. Roy left the Indian Communist Party and founded the Radical Humanists. So in a way, they were following the same rejection of this kind of the ends justify the means hierarchical approach.
What was it, something that the Indian Communist Party did during the war? Do you know this part?
No, I don't. Yeah, they were obeying the Soviet Union. That was the problem.
So
who were supporting the British.
We've come to the end of this program, but I'm going to ask my colleagues here. Oh, the very last question. Okay. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. My name is Kader Abadi. I'm former UN official and author and United Nations correspondent. I thank the distinguished panelists for a very stimulating evening, first of all. And the figure you have been talking about is very interesting. She has so many aspects to her character, but one thing that comes out of your discussion is that she was involved, as Professor Desai said, globally. The others used internationalization. So I would like to ask a general question. How significant was the role of women in the struggle for independence and national liberation worldwide? Thank you.
Oh, worldwide, I don't
that's
know.
The last question.
That, I think, worldwide, I don't know, but we could at least talk about the Indian context.
Okay.
All right. Here you go.
It was as much women who led the struggle for independence in India as much men. And they participated equally. They marched on the streets, they burnt cloth, they went to jail, they spun khadi, wore khadi, they sacrificed family lives. So the Indian women were as much a part of the freedom struggle as men. And they also threw bombs. It was an equal struggle for freedom. At that time, independence from colonialism. And then Kamaladevi, of course, went on to define that freedom in many different ways by setting up institutions in which culture, craft, art played a big role in building our consciousness, our independent consciousness. So she continued on that path. And economic development, of course, as you've heard, Indian women then continued to play a role in the economic development, which was more feminized, which was based on what people could do at the grassroots. And that is what is being reversed right now, which is why all of us in the room are so troubled about it, because the scale of the Indian experiment was huge. And the legacy that it has created in the world today is beautiful, because it is the one country which has succeeded against colonialism, stood on its own 2 feet and carried people along after 300 years of colonialism, in which we had a famine in which people died. In 70 years, we have had no famine, we've had hunger. So there are lots of things which we have tackled, and that is being dismantled through a new form of fascism, which is emerging in the world right now. And that's why this conversation between the 4 of us and everyone in the room today.
Thank you. Last word, Gloria. And Ellen, please.
Dare I say what I'm thinking?
Can you not?
Okay. We got colonialism from patriarchy. all right? Because relatively new in human history is the control of women's bodies in order to decide how many, and to force women to have more children than they would otherwise have had, which, to the extent that it overpopulated Europe, caused the invention of racism to justify colonialism to take over other people's countries. Okay. I just want to say that because there is nothing, women, we can't do anything by ourselves, half the human race, but neither can the other half. Okay. You know, it is not, movements are not in silos like this, and certainly the female half of the human race is, you know, nothing can be solved without both halves, and it is one of the great frustrations, I think, for racial liberation movements and women's liberation movements and so on, to be thought of as separate from politics or separate from, right? It is just not possible. And the single biggest right now, the single biggest influence on whether a nation is violent within itself or whether it will use military violence against another country is not poverty, not access to natural resources, not religion or even degree of democracy. It's violence against females or control and dominance of females, because that's what we see first. Patriarchy is the first step in higher. Then that sort of convinces us, because we see it at home and in the street, that it's okay for one group to dominate another. They were born to dominate another. And then all the rest of the hierarchy follows. So it is through composed, right? It is not separable. It is not separable. And now that we are on this spaceship Earth, where for the first time there's so much violence against females that there are now fewer females on Earth than males, as the United Nations can tell us. It's especially important that we understand how through composed it is. When we try to figure out which groups are terrorist groups, for instance, you can tell by the fact that they are way gender polarized. Terrorist groups are way into profoundly masculine, feminine roles and profoundly hostile to women's equality. And you can tell more peaceful, more democratic groups by the fact that the roles are not polarized. They're much more porous and close to each other. This just has to be, as Kamaladevi knew, part of everything, not separate, part of everything.
On that note, I have to say,
I want to personally thank the Asia Society for this. It's a little book, and it's getting the attention it needs from the Asia Society. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Asia Society. There you go. But thank you all for coming. And I think that if Kamaladevi was here, she would have been very pleased to have heard the last things that Gloria said.
And I have to say, there are books at the bookstore.
Right.
That's very important.
Books, signed books are available
and it's
outside.
It's a great book, and I mean that in a completely non-personal way.
Thank you.